July 23, 1945. The coastline of Karafuto Prefecture, southern Sakhalin. The morning sun rises weak and gray, its light struggling to cut through the thick coastal fog. For Section Chief Kenji Ito of the Imperial Government Railways, the scene before him is a nightmare rendered in twisted steel and scorched earth. He stands on the embankment, the damp air thick with the acrid stench of burnt coal, oil, and something else, something metallic and sharp that stings the back of the throat. Before him lies the carcass of the 4:52 a.m. northbound supply train. It is not merely derailed, it has been obliterated. This is impossible, Ito thinks, his mind refusing to process the chaos. His gloved hand trembles slightly as he adjusts his spectacles. No air raid warnings. No sightings of enemy aircraft from the coastal watchtowers. The B-29s fly too high for this kind of precision, and carrier planes would have been spotted. This was a ground attack, here, on the sacred soil of the homeland. He walks cautiously along the edge of the crater. It is immense, a raw, brown wound, gouged into the earth where the main track had only been yesterday. The steel rails are bent upwards at grotesque angles, like supplicating arms. The locomotive, a powerful D-51 class engine weighing over 125 tons, has been thrown clear of the tracks and lies on its side, steam still hissing from ruptured pipes in pathetic, dying gasps. Behind it, the first few cars are a compressed accordion of splintered wood and metal. The rest of the 16-car consist is scattered, some turned to splinters, others burned out shells, their cargo of munitions having cooked off in a chain reaction of secondary explosions throughout the pre-dawn hours. A grim-faced Kempeitai captain, a man named Otsuka, crouches near the epicenter of the blast. He gestures Ito over. "Look," he says, his voice flat. He points with a stick to small, peculiar fragments of metal embedded in the dirt. They are not pieces of a bomb casing. They are too small, too intricate. One piece looks like part of a pressure switch, unlike any device in the Imperial Army's arsenal. Then another soldier calls out. He's found tracks, not the heavy boot prints of soldiers, but fainter impressions, leading from the tangled brush near the beach. They are the marks of men who moved quickly, and they lead directly to the high tide line, where they simply vanish into the sea. This discovery sends a jolt of ice through Ito's veins. It transforms an act of sabotage into an act of terrifying audacity. An enemy that can strike from the sea, leave no trace, and melt away is a phantom, an enemy that defies all conventional military logic. The entire defense of Karafuto was predicated on the assumption that the threat lay in the sky, or in a full-scale amphibious assault. The thousands of miles of coastline were a natural fortress, its waters patrolled, and its shores watched. The idea that a small team could simply walk ashore from the ocean itself, plant a device of such devastating power, and escape undetected was not just a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. For the defenders of Japan, the war had just changed. The front line was no longer hundreds of miles away in the Pacific. As of this morning, it was anywhere an enemy was bold enough to step out of the water. The journey to this stunning act of sabotage, an act that blurred the line between naval and land warfare, had begun 18 months earlier in the freezing cold of the North Atlantic. On January 27, 1944, a 33-year-old lieutenant commander named Eugene Fluckey assumed command of the USS Barb, SS-220. The Barb was a Jito-class fleet submarine, a formidable predator of the deep. 311 feet of hardened steel, displacing 2,400 tons submerged, powered by 4 massive Fairbanks Morse diesel engines and armed with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. She had already completed 7 war patrols, a seasoned veteran of the war in Europe and the Pacific. But under Jean Fluckey, she was about to become a legend. Fluckey was not a typical submarine commander. A 1935 graduate of the Naval Academy, he possessed a potent combination of intellect, meticulous attention to detail, and an almost unsettling level of offensive aggression. He instilled in his 80-man crew a simple, unwavering philosophy. As he told them upon taking command, "We will not be a one-shot sub. We will not fire a torpedo and then run. We will attack, and we will keep attacking until the enemy is destroyed." His words were not bravado, they were a promise. He trained his men relentlessly, drilling them in torpedo reloads until they could get a fresh fish in the tube in under a minute. He pushed the Barb's engines and equipment to their absolute limits, believing that speed and audacity were his greatest armor. On his very first patrol in command, the Barb's 8th, Fluckey demonstrated his unique brand of warfare. Patrolling south of the Philippines, he sank a 6,000-ton Japanese freighter. But it was his subsequent patrols that began to build his fearsome reputation. On the 9th patrol, he earned his first Navy Cross, sinking a Japanese escort carrier and crippling a tanker. On the 10th, he earned his second, sinking a 10,000-ton tanker and 2 escort vessels. He favored daring surface attacks at night, using the Barb's superior speed to outrun and outmaneuver Japanese escorts, a tactic that terrified his targets and often confounded his superiors. But it was the Barb's 11th War Patrol in January 1945 that cemented Fluckey's status as a master of undersea warfare and earned him the Medal of Honor. His patrol area was the Formosa Strait and the China coast, a treacherous stretch of water the submariners had grimly nicknamed Hirohito's Bowling Alley. On January 23rd, Fluckey received intelligence about a large Japanese convoy, over 30 ships, hiding in Nam Quan Harbor on the China coast. The harbor was a death trap. It was extremely shallow, averaging just 30 feet, barely enough for a submarine to operate. It was also heavily mined and protected by destroyers. Standard procedure was to wait for the convoy to come out. Fluckey saw it differently. He saw an opportunity. In his own words, from his book Thunder Below, "The Japs probably think they're safe in there. The last place they'd expect an attack is in their own bathtub." That night, under the cover of darkness and a driving rain squall, Fluckey took the Barb on the surface straight into the harbor. He navigated by radar and dead reckoning through the shoals and minefields, his crew at battle stations, the tension in the control room thick enough to cut with a knife. Once inside, he found the convoy at anchor. He maneuvered the Barb into a perfect firing position and, in a breathtakingly audacious move, fired a full spread of torpedoes from his forward tubes. Then, instead of turning to flee, he ordered the boat to race further into the harbor, swung the stern around, and fired all 4 of his aft torpedoes at a secondary group of ships. The harbor erupted in fire and chaos. Multiple ships were hit, including a large ammunition vessel that detonated in a cataclysmic explosion, lighting up the entire coastline. Now came the impossible part: escape. With Japanese destroyers bearing down, their searchlights slicing through the dark, Fluckey ordered flank speed ahead. He was betting everything on the power of his diesel engines and the element of surprise. The Barb raced through the shallow waters at over 23 knots, a speed no Japanese commander believed a submarine could achieve on the surface. She dodged shells and outran her pursuers, making it back to the open sea. When the battle damage was assessed, Fluckey had sunk or damaged multiple ships totaling over 30,000 tons. He had single-handedly shattered an entire enemy convoy in their own safe harbor without suffering a single casualty. This was the man and the crew who, just 6 months later, would find themselves staring through a periscope at a Japanese railway line, thinking not of torpedoes, but of dynamite. The action in Namquan Harbor was a turning point, not just for the crew of the Barb, but for the very nature of their mission. By the spring of 1945, the strategic situation in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. Years of relentless Allied attrition had decimated the Japanese merchant marine. The once mighty convoys that fed Japan's war machine were now scattered remnants, hunted to near extinction by American submarines, aircraft, and surface ships. For submarine commanders like Eugene Fluckey, the vast hunting grounds of the Pacific were becoming barren. Prime targets were few and far between. A new, more aggressive approach was needed. Recognizing this shift, the U.S. Navy began experimenting with ways to use submarines for more than just sinking ships. The most promising innovation was the installation of deck-mounted, 5-inch, unguided rocket launchers. The USS Barb was among the first submarines selected for this modification during her refit at Pearl Harbor in April 1945. The system was rudimentary but effective. A simple steel frame holding 12 spin-stabilized rockets was bolted to the forward deck. It could not be aimed precisely and had to be reloaded on the surface, but it gave the submarine the ability to project power ashore, to become a stealthy, mobile artillery platform. Fluckey embraced this new capability with his characteristic zeal. On the Barb's 12th and final war patrol, he put the rockets to immediate use. On June 22, 1945, the Barb surfaced off the town of Shari on the northern coast of Hokkaido, Japan. The crew unleashed their first rocket barrage, sending a dozen 5-inch projectiles screaming into a lumber mill and other industrial facilities. The Japanese defenders were caught completely by surprise. Their coastal defense guns were designed to engage ships at sea, not a low-profile submarine firing rockets from less than a mile offshore. Before they could mount an effective response, the Barb had submerged and vanished. A pattern of coastal raiding began to emerge. The Barb became a ghost, haunting the Sea of Okhotsk. They struck the town of Shibatoro on the island of Etorofu in the Kurils, bombarding a government-run cannery. They hit a shipyard in the town of Kaihioto, setting it ablaze with a volley of rockets. Each attack followed the same terrifying script for the Japanese. A submarine would surface without warning in the dead of night, unleash a torrent of fire and destruction on a coastal town, and then disappear back into the depths before dawn. From the Japanese perspective, these attacks were deeply unsettling. The home islands, which had been insulated from the ground war for centuries, were now being directly assaulted. While not as devastating as the B-29 firebombing raids on major cities, these pinprick attacks by the Barb had a disproportionate psychological impact. They demonstrated that no part of the coastline was safe. A factory, a shipyard, or even a small fishing village could become a target at any moment. The Imperial Japanese Army was forced to divert resources and manpower to guard hundreds of miles of remote coastline against a threat that was impossible to predict. For the advantage for Fluckey and his crew was absolute. The submarine's ability to approach a target submerged and unseen, strike with overwhelming surprise, and then use the ocean itself as an escape route was a tactical problem the Japanese had no answer for. But for Eugene Fluckey, this was still not enough. Bombarding towns from the sea was effective, but it was still indirect. He began to look for a way to put American boots on Japanese soil, and his periscope soon found the perfect target. But by July 1945, the tactical picture in the Sea of Okhotsk was evolving once more. While the rocket attacks were successful, Fluckey was driven by a relentless desire to innovate and inflict maximum damage. The turning point came during a period of submerged reconnaissance off the coast of Karafuto, the Japanese portion of Sakhalin Island. For hours, Fluckey patiently observed the coastline through the number 1 periscope. He watched fishing boats, noted coastal defenses, and mapped out potential targets. And then he saw it. A railway line, running parallel to the shore, a critical artery carrying supplies, lumber, and likely munitions from the island's interior to its ports. A radical idea began to form in his mind. He later recalled his thought process. We're sinking the ships that bring the supplies to Japan. The trains are distributing those supplies within Japan. Why don't we sink a train? The concept was audacious to the point of seeming insane. Submarines were naval vessels. Their crews were sailors, engineers, and torpedo men, not commandos. A land-based sabotage mission was entirely outside their operational doctrine. When Fluckey gathered his officers in the wardroom to propose the idea, the initial reaction was stunned silence, followed by a wave of cautious excitement. The risks were astronomical. The Barb would have to surface less than 1,000 yards from an enemy-held coast in waters that could be patrolled. It would have to remain stationary on the surface for the duration of the raid, a sitting duck for any shore battery or patrol craft that might spot it. The landing party itself would be completely isolated, armed only with light weapons, with no hope of reinforcement if discovered. If anything went wrong, the men would be lost, and the submarine itself could be compromised. Yet the potential reward was equally immense. A successful raid would not only destroy a vital supply link, but would also deliver a psychological shockwave to the Japanese high command, proving that American forces could strike at will anywhere on their sacred homeland. Meticulous planning began at once. Fluckey called for volunteers for the 8-man shore party, with one strict condition: only unmarried men would be considered. The response was overwhelming. He handpicked his team not for their brawn, but for their brains and specific skills. He chose men who had been Boy Scouts, reasoning they would have essential fieldcraft skills. The final team was a cross-section of the submarine's crew. It was led by the engineering officer, Lieutenant William M. Walker. With him were Chief Pharmacist's Mate Paul G. Saunders, Gunner's Mate 2nd Class William Hatfield, Motor Machinist's Mate 1st Class Lawrence Wong Newland, Electrician's Mate 3rd Class Billy R. Hatfield, William's brother, Signalman's 2nd Class James E. Richard, Motor Machinist Mate 2nd Class John C. Wallace, and Torpedoman's Mate 3rd Class Edward W. Klingesmith. The team included an officer, a medic, an explosives expert, mechanics, and an electrician, a self-contained special operations unit drawn from the ranks of ordinary sailors. Their primary weapon would be a 55-pound scuttling charge, a standard demolition block used to sink friendly ships to prevent their capture. The trigger mechanism was a stroke of pure American ingenuity. Lacking a proper pressure detonator, the ship's electricians improvised. They took a micro-switch from the salvage of a downed Japanese plane, a delicate device designed to be triggered by the slightest pressure. They mounted it inside a wooden box that could be wedged between the rails, so that the weight of a passing train's wheel would depress a small wooden wedge, close the circuit, and detonate the charge. For weeks, the team rehearsed in the forward torpedo room, practicing paddling their 2 rubber rafts and handling the explosives in the cramped, humid space. The night of July 22, 1945 was chosen for the raid. The weather was overcast with no moon. At 11:45 p.m., the Barb surfaced silently, a dark shape against the black water, just 950 yards from the Karafuto coast. The command, "Land the landing party," was passed quietly over the intercom. The 8 men, their faces darkened with soot, carrying carbines and a Tommy gun, slipped into their rubber boats and paddled away from the sub. The only sounds were the gentle dip of their paddles and the thumping of their own hearts. After a tense 20-minute paddle, they hit the beach. Lieutenant Walker split the team into 2 groups. 4 men, including the Hatfield brothers, set up a defensive perimeter, while Walker led the other 3 on a dead sprint across 400 yards of open ground, a drainage ditch, and a highway to reach the railway embankment. They began digging furiously into the hard-packed gravel ballast beneath the tracks, the sound of their shovels seeming thunderously loud in the silence. Suddenly, a lookout hissed a warning. A train was coming. It was an unscheduled patrol train approaching far sooner than their intelligence had suggested. Panic set in. They weren't ready. As the locomotive's single headlight cut a bright, terrifying cone through the darkness, the men worked with frantic speed. They shoved the 55-pound charge into the shallow hole, and Billy Hatfield, the electrician, fumbled with the wires in the dark, connecting them to the delicate microswitch. With the train bearing down on them just seconds away, they finished the connection and scrambled back down the embankment, diving for cover. The patrol train thundered past, its wheels missing the detonator by a mere fraction of an inch. They had been unbelievably lucky. Shaken but determined, they crept back, repositioned the switch, and began their desperate race back to the beach, back to the rafts, and back to the waiting submarine. The main event was still to come. The staggering success of the Barb's train-busting raid cannot be understood by merely examining the submarine's specifications. The Gato class was a brilliantly designed vessel, a pinnacle of wartime engineering, but it was never intended for amphibious special operations. Its design philosophy was centered on endurance, stealth, and lethality at sea. The true design philosophy that made the mission possible resided not in the blueprints of the submarine, but in the mind of its commander, Eugene Fluckey, and the culture he cultivated within his crew. Fluckey's command philosophy was a radical departure from the rigid, top-down hierarchy that characterized many military units. Its origins lay in his core belief that the man on the spot, the one with his hands on the equipment or his eyes on the target, often had the best solution. His approach was built on three pillars: meticulous preparation, empowerment of the crew, and calculated, audacious risk-taking. While other commanders issued orders, Fluckey posed problems. He would present a tactical challenge to his officers and enlisted men and invite them to help him solve it. This collaborative approach fostered a powerful sense of ownership and innovation throughout the ship. The impossible choice facing a conventional submarine commander in Fluckey's position would have been starkly simple: stick to the doctrine. The submarine's role was to sink ships. A land raid was a mission for the Marines or Army Rangers, not sailors. The established rules of engagement provided a clear, safe, and defensible path. To deviate from that path was to invite career-ending failure, and more importantly, risk the lives of his men and his multi-million-dollar vessel for a mission it was never designed to perform. Fluckey, however, saw the situation through a different lens. He performed a different kind of calculation, one that weighed the immense risks against the unique opportunity. The design trade-off was clear. He would sacrifice the submarine's primary defense, stealth and mobility, by holding it stationary on the surface near an enemy coast. He would risk a small, irreplaceable team of his own men on a mission with no precedent and no support. The potential cost was catastrophic failure. The potential gain was a strategic victory of psychological warfare, proving to the enemy that their homeland was porous and vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. This decision was not made in a vacuum. It was the culmination of his entire command. The crew's ability to even attempt such a mission was a direct result of Fluckey's leadership. For example, the critical micro-switch detonator wasn't a piece of standard-issue equipment. It was an improvised device conceived and built by the ship's electricians because they had been empowered to experiment and innovate. The selection of Boy Scouts for the shore party wasn't a whimsical choice. It was a logical decision by a commander who valued practical skills over rank or specialization. He understood that a man who knew how to read a compass, tie a knot, and move quietly through the woods was more valuable on that beach than a seasoned sailor who had never left the deck of a ship. His justification for this immense risk was rooted in the strategic context of summer 1945. The war was in its brutal endgame. An invasion of Japan was on the horizon, an operation that was projected to cost over 1 million Allied casualties. In Fluckey's view, any action, no matter how unconventional, that could disrupt Japanese logistics, shatter their morale, and potentially shorten the war by even a single day, was not just justified, it was a moral imperative. He wrote in his memoirs that his goal was to create the greatest amount of havoc and confusion possible. The train raid was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. It was a testament to the idea that a commander's greatest weapon is not the ship he commands, but the ingenuity and trust he inspires in his crew. The Barb was not merely a vessel of war. Fluckey had redesigned it into a platform for audacious, unconventional warfare. Back in the submerged, silent control room of the USS Barb, the tension was absolute. The 8 saboteurs were safely aboard, dripping seawater and adrenaline onto the deck plates. Now all 80 men held their breath and waited. Fluckey was glued to the periscope, his eye pressed against the rubber eyepiece, scanning the dark coastline. The hydrophone operator listened intently, his face a mask of concentration. The sub was rigged for silent running, every unnecessary piece of equipment shut down. The only sound was the faint hum of the gyros and the quiet breathing of the crew. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, at 1:47 a.m. on July 23, 1945, the hydrophone operator's eyes went wide. He held up a hand. "I hear it, Captain. Train sounds, high speed." Every man in the control room strained to listen. Through the hull, they could feel more than hear a faint, low-frequency rumble growing in intensity. In the periscope, Fluckey saw it, a pinprick of light that grew steadily into the bright, round headlamp of a steam locomotive racing along the coast. He gave a running commentary in a low, steady voice. "Train approaching the target area. It's a long one. He's moving fast. Stand by." The next moment was seared into the memory of every man aboard. A brilliant, silent flash of white light erupted on the shore, instantly illuminating the entire coastline in stark photographic detail. Seconds later, the sound wave, a massive, deafening boom, struck the submarine's hull like a physical blow, rattling the entire boat. A second, even larger fireball blossomed into the night sky as the train's cargo of munitions cooked off, a volcanic eruption of orange and red that climbed hundreds of feet into the air. Through the periscope, Fluckey had a front-row seat to the devastation. He saw the locomotive lift off the tracks and fly through the air, end over end, before crashing down in a shower of sparks. He saw freight cars disintegrate, their contents scattered like toys. He saw the entire 16-car train pile up in a catastrophic screeching wreck of twisted metal and fire. A triumphant roar erupted throughout the submarine. Men cheered, slapped each other on the back, and pounded on the bulkheads. Fluckey, ever the professional, simply lowered the periscope and turned to his executive officer with a calm, satisfied smile. "Let's get the hell out of here." On shore, the scene was of utter chaos and disbelief. The massive explosion had not only destroyed the train and killed an estimated 150 Japanese soldiers and crew, but it had also severed the island's most critical transportation line. Japanese authorities were thrown into a state of panic. Initial reports assumed a new type of Allied aerial bomb or even a naval bombardment. But when investigators found the strange fragments of the microswitch and the footprints leading to the sea, a terrifying and unbelievable conclusion began to dawn on them. They had been attacked by sea-borne commandos. The psychological impact far outweighed the material damage. If a small team could land undetected and wreak such havoc, then no part of the Japanese homeland was truly safe. On board the Barb, As it slipped away into the deep, safe waters of the Okhotsk, the celebration was in full swing. The 8 members of the shore party, nicknamed Fluckey's Follies, were the heroes of the hour. But their victory needed to be commemorated. The crew broke out the boat's battle flag, a large silk banner that documented their wartime achievements. Alongside the painted Japanese naval ensigns representing sunken warships and the rising sun flags for merchant vessels, a new, unique symbol was carefully painted, a perfect, detailed miniature of a Japanese steam locomotive. It was a symbol of defiance, a badge of honor for a feat of arms no other submarine crew in history could claim. The train raid of July 23, 1945, was the audacious capstone to one of the most distinguished combat careers of any vessel in the United States Navy. When the USS Barb returned to port at the end of her 12th and final war patrol, her statistics were staggering. Under the command of Eugene Fluckey, she was officially credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels, including an aircraft carrier, totaling 96,628 tons. This record made her the single most successful American submarine of World War II by tonnage sunk. For his incredible command during the Barb's final 3 patrols, Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor and an unprecedented 4 Navy Crosses, making him one of the most decorated combatants of the war. The accounting of the train raid itself reads like a study in asymmetrical warfare. One Gatto-class submarine and its 80-man crew projected a force of just 8 volunteer sailors. Using one improvised 55-pound scuttling charge, they completely destroyed a 16-car train, killed or wounded over 150 enemy personnel, severed a vital supply line, and inflicted a significant psychological blow upon the Japanese military. The cost to the American side was 0 casualties and 0 equipment lost. It remains the only instance of a ground combat operation conducted by U.S. military forces on the Japanese home islands during the entirety of World War II. When compared to the major ground campaigns of the Pacific, the raid's efficiency is astonishing. The Battle of Iwo Jima, for example, involved over 70,000 U.S. Marines to capture an 8-square-mile island, resulting in nearly 27,000 American casualties. The Battle of Okinawa saw over 180,000 American troops pitted against 120,000 Japanese, with U.S. casualties exceeding 50,000. These were necessary, brutal slugging matches. The Barb's raid, by contrast, was a surgical strike, a testament to what a small, well-led, and highly motivated unit could achieve through ingenuity and surprise. The raid perfectly encapsulated a fundamental difference in military philosophy. The Japanese military system, while valuing bravery and sacrifice, was often rigid and hierarchical, discouraging initiative at lower levels. The American system, at its best, fostered the opposite. It empowered commanders like Fluckey to assess a situation, deviate from doctrine, and seize fleeting opportunities. The Navy didn't order Fluckey to blow up a train. They trusted him to wage war effectively in his designated patrol area. He, in turn, trusted his men, his engineers, his electricians, his torpedo men, to devise the novel solutions required to turn a wild idea into a successful mission. The story of the Barb's land battle is the ultimate example of mission command, proving that the American emphasis on flexibility and individual initiative could be a decisive weapon of war. The twisted steel on the Karafuto coast was more than the wreckage of a train. It was the wreckage of an assumption, the deeply held Japanese belief in the inviolability of their sacred homeland. The investigation, which found only baffling fragments and footprints that disappeared into the surf, provided the final, terrifying proof that the enemy was no longer at the gates, he was inside the house. The raid occurred on July 23, 1945. Just 2 weeks later, on August 6th, the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, Nagasaki was destroyed. The Barb's raid was one of the final audacious blows landed on an empire that was reeling but not yet broken. It served as a small but potent piece of the overwhelming evidence presented to the Japanese High Command that the Allies could and would strike anywhere by any means necessary, from the atomic bomb to a handful of sailors on a dark beach. The final irony of the USS Barb's celebrated career is profound. A vessel designed as the ultimate predator of the deep, a weapon created to send enemy ships to the bottom of the ocean, found its most enduring fame by acting as a commando transport. For one night, this pinnacle of naval engineering became an infantry assault craft, and her torpedo crew became saboteurs. This fusion of roles, this blurring of the lines between sea and land warfare, foreshadowed the multi-mission capabilities that would come to define modern special operations-capable submarines decades later. The lesson of the Barb and her train-busting crew is a timeless testament to the power of human ingenuity in the face of rigid doctrine. It proves that the most effective weapon in any conflict is not the one with the longest range or the largest warhead, but the one guided by a determined and imaginative mind willing to write its own rulebook. The raid stands as an eternal tribute to the American sailors' can-do spirit, a spirit that took a submarine, an improvised explosive, and 8 volunteers, and forged them into a weapon the enemy could never predict. The USS Barb did not just sink ships. Under the command of Eugene Fluckey, she waged a war of the imagination. The train raid was not merely an act of sabotage, it was a message delivered by 8 sailors under the cover of darkness that for the Empire of Japan there was no longer any place to hide. And in that single explosive act lies the entire story of how American audacity took the fight to the enemy's very doorstep using a weapon they never saw coming.